final also seminar of the year. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Vanessa Barker, who's Professor of Sociology at the University of Stockholm. She's the author of The Politics of Imprisonment and Nordic Nationalism and Penal Order, a book well known to any of you on the MSc who did the theorising punishment class this year. She's also editor of Punishment Society, has been a visitor here and in Oslo and in Princeton, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you back. And the title is advertised on the screen behind you, so I shall leave it to you to explain what it all means. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Thank you for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here. I guess I had intended to have a much more finished and polished paper and book ready to put out, but what's happening instead is different threads of research that I started after the Nordic nationalism book, and these different threads are in some ways going in a bit of different direction. And so I'm in this talk trying to put some of these ideas and empirical trends together and assessing kind of in real time whether or not it should actually pursue that or abandon ship. And I trust you in the room to actually give substantive feedback about the nature of some of these questions, the nature of some of the research. And so it's a really invitation to think through some of these issues that I've been grappling with, and it could end up being separate pieces, or it could end up being kind of together. So I am taking the opportunity to think through with you, and so I really appreciate the kind of feedback. And so what this is about is oh, okay, are we ready here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. What this is about, so when I finished Nordic nationalism and penal order, this was a case about Sweden, about how Sweden responded to the refugee crisis and basically closed the borders in order to preserve the welfare state. This kind of idea of welfare nationalism or penal nationalism, using the tools of punishment, of policing in order to grapple with migration, all to uphold the welfare state. That argument was very much an internal argument about the internal logic of the welfare state, about what it means to be a member, about what it means to sustain a welfare state, the perceived threats of migration to a welfare state. When I finished that book, it was pretty self-contained, but a lot of questions came up when I was presenting it and talking about it. Was, well, surely, Sweden is part of a global process, right? Or there's other countries, there's other processes involved. It's not just this internal. Can you connect what's happening in Sweden to some of these global processes? And so this effort in some way is to try to grapple with the kind of outside of Sweden in this relationship between migration control, penal control, and in Sweden. This is image, right? This is the argument of Nordic nationalism, right? To kind of uphold the society, this affluent life, right? For those who belong, this all depends on this. And this is the EU-Turkey deal, which basically Turkey agreed to basically house Syrians in Turkey. This is hundreds of thousands of people. This has been going on now for several years, many hundreds of millions of euros, and this process has been going on. And so what I wanted to do after the Nordic nationalism book was to try to explain or figure out, right, what is this relationship, right? How do we maintain this life, but it's absolutely dependent on this, and how do we get to that? How do we make sense of that? So I started to work more on the kind of externalization, these external borders, picking up some themes from border criminology, right? There's been a lot of research done on this, right? When we try and look at border control outside of particular nations and look right across the EU. This map is it's about Frontex, the kind of center there, but these kind of pinpoints of where there have other locations, just to give us a sense, right, that Sweden is up here in the north, but this border control going well beyond the borders of Sweden. This is was the Mora refugee camp, which has since burned down, right? These kind of images of the camp life, with, again, people who study this in border criminology to become very familiar with. This is a prison in Kosovo, which is also part of this external bordering. And this is a proposal from Denmark to basically house foreign prisoners who are awaiting deportation in prisons in Kosovo. And this is what in Sweden is, what I'll get to at the very end, wants to basically emulate what's happening in Denmark and starting to investigate what it would take to have prisoners outside of Sweden. So I was looking at these things. Also came across this more recently. This was a migrant detention center in Ukraine that was not evacuated in the beginning of the war when Russia invaded. I do believe the number of families are out of there now, but this was, I was surprised to read that there was actually a migration detention center in Ukraine. So when we think about Sweden, we think about the EU, but now there's facilities in Ukraine and much, much further beyond, right? The kind of extension of this external bordering. So these examples and practices, these were, maybe more familiar to those who are working in border crim. You also have new actors involved, right? So this is the Swedish Coast Guard. They've been involved since 2015-16 in search and rescue in Mediterranean or in the Aegean, but they have said their own mission has changed to one that was heavily focused on search and rescue to now border surveillance. And this was a result of the EU-Turkey deal. And this is the Swedish Coast Guard, but this is also part, and others have written about this as well, the kind of increased militarization, right, to deal with migration, interdiction, the idea that you would, prevent onward migration. And we're using a whole new set of actors and agencies. And now you have, what was Frontex is the EU Coast Guard. And it's also interesting what the EU agreed on for military power is their frontline job is migration, right? This is how they've come to agree that this was okay, right? We can form a military in order to basically try to prevent onward migration. So these are, state actors. But when I was also investigating this push towards the external border and trying to prevent migration, I came across this case. And this, in some ways, may have been, it was surprising to me, but maybe it's not so surprising. And what is this? What are we looking at? This was in 2016. Members from the Sweden Democrats, the far-right party in Sweden, traveled to Greece to prevent onward migration. These members here, these three with the windbreakers, these are I call them SD. Okay, so the Sweden Democrats. These are SD members. They're on this beach in Lesbos, and they are walking right up to people who have landed, and they are giving them basically it's an misinformation campaign about what it's like in Sweden, and trying to prevent and block them from mobility. And they have, the windbreaker, it says Sweden Democrats on the back, and there's a little flower on there. If I didn't tell you that these were SD members, you might mistake them for NGO, right, or humanitarian workers out there volunteering, right, for help, right? So then they approach, they don't look like, some of the images that we might be used to when we think about the far right. But there they are. I'm going to come back to this image in this. This was one of their reasonings for going there. This is a quote from basically their publicist, and this is their symbol, SD. As a party, we feel we have tried everything in our power, purely parliamentary, to respond to the destructive policies that Sweden pursues. We need to be in place to reduce the flow of refugees. So this was a direct call, right, from inside the party to go right to Lesbos and try to block refugees. And this was when the Swedish government was a red-green coalition on the left, right? So this was back in, again, 2016. So my question is, right, so studying the kind of state violence aspect or the penal power, that part sort of, developing and familiar with, but then the far right presence there kind of created new puzzles for me, and that they were traveling to Greece, right, totally outside any bounds. And what also strikes me as interesting and important and possibly disturbing as well, is the scale of the violence that's involved in all of this, right? So we have a multitude of institutions and actors, a multitude of different kinds of violence. I talked about repertoires of violence because it's not just one form of violence. There's multiple forms. And what's happening, I think, at the border is that we're kind of beyond just the idea of a kind of force or non-force, right? There's a really blurring of lines of who's actually doing violence and how we might even understand what that violence is. So this direct and indirect forms of coercion that are present that are trying to constrain the agency and self-determination of other people. This is a broader definition that comes from Menjivar and Abrego. They're dealing with migration law as well. And I adopt that view that it's not just about state power, but there's other forms which can help to account for these other actors that are there. And it's not just a matter of kind of force or non-force. It's a much more, there's many more activities going on which are blocking, right, the self-determination. What's also striking after working in this area for so long, in a way, is the proliferation of all of this violence and the normalization. So when we talk about migration in the use of violence, penal power, it still surprises me that when you give a talk, especially maybe in academics or public audience, that that there seems to be like I'm okay with that because we have to protect our nation. This is the prerogative of what democracies are. And so it still strikes me that it's somehow been normalized that we're actually using these forms of violence. We have to kind of pull back a little bit and actually question how and why this violence is normalized in democracies, but carrying out for democratic societies, right? Democratic societies completely rely on violence in order to maintain themselves. So some of these questions again, right, are coming up. Like, well, so we have the role of the state here, and the presence of the far right, and how do we make sense of that? In the Swedish case, it is puzzling because the far right were outside of government and they presented themselves as a counter to the government, but they were in fact doing the work of the government. Shortly after the Swedish government closed the border, but they kept presenting themselves as if they were doing something different and more. The timing, the goals, the practices, the motivation, are these the same? Are they different? How do we document that? The right, the far right, the radical right, there's different names for these different kinds of groups, and the role of the state or state violence, penal institutions. These have been studied separately for the most part. And that also seems a bit surprising, right? Because they actually can go hand in hand. But the way that they developed in the literature and the theories, right, they've kind of taken on a different directions. And this Claire Hamilton has a great piece in Punishment and Society that just came, it's from last year, that presents sort of reasons why they develop separately and calls for an agenda to try to bring them together. She focuses on the emotional realm, right? The kind of parallels between the use of these violences and the far right and these grievances on this kind of more on the level of emotions. In the literature, right, on the far right, they're also presented as bad actors corrupting good societies. This is a very common way that when we start to understand the radical right, that they are corrupting what are otherwise like good, healthy democracies. In a place like Sweden, they're still constructed as somehow some kind of exogenous force. And others who write about this, Kasmud, but others who say we have to actually leave this outsider paradigm behind. These far right movements are from within the society, and often they capitalize on very similar cultural narratives, right? They might be more amplified, they might at times go in different directions, but they are definitely part of the societies that we're in. They're not some separate element. And so it's also kind of trying to capture also the normalization of these parties within democratic societies. The other piece of this is that the presence of these far right in the Lesbos case, it also unsettles conventional pairings. So we usually think of extremism as using violence to overrun democratic societies, and we usually think of nonviolence, right, as compatible with democratic goals. But we have a case where you have a party using violence, and they would say to uphold democratic goals. So it unsettles. This has been a taken for granted setup about who uses violence and for what purposes. So these are kind of some of the ideas I had about trying to grapple with this phenomenon. And in addition, and this is maybe the part that's giving me a really hard time, is the spatial dimension. So I'm trained as a sociologist, and sociology is about studying society with a capital S that is bound by a territory. But all of these processes, right, go well outside of a society. And what are the tools, analytical tools that we have to try to grapple with those relations? And I would say the same for sociology of punishment. It's based on a kind of classic view of what society constitutes. And so when we start to actually take into account the space, all these other challenges come up. And so these are some of the challenge, empirical and theoretical challenges that I've been grappling with, right? So how do we these processes that are cannot be contained within the nation state? How do we identify them? How do we understand them, explain them? What are the boundaries of society and democracy? I think once we kind of grapple with this, it may change our view of the character and meaning of penal regimes themselves, right? How we conceptualize them, how we measure them, how we compare them. And Melina Tripkovich, she's got an excellent piece in the British Journal of Criminology recently, which looks at this denaturalization and what happens with citizenship when it kind of leaves borders and states. So she's and Kirsi Lona is also working on this, right? To really trying to grapple with what this might mean for ideas about justice or penal regimes. Myself as a sociologist, I'm also trying to come to grips with what does it mean about the society? Like, what are we actually dealing with? Is this the true nature of liberal democracies, or is this illiberalism, right? These are like, are we on the road to unfreedom? Is this for some of us, or is this for all of us? Like, how do we actually characterize this, right, empirically and conceptually? Methodological challenges. The object of study is moving, right? The border, right? These practices, the actors, the timing. How do we draw limitations or delimit the boundaries, right? So if we put boundaries on it, then we are reifying that process that this is a society, and we're going to study the processes inside when, right, migration and use of violence is occurring, right, across borders and across all different kinds of space. So it presents a number of difficulties. These transnational processes, again, right, the spatial dimension. So there's examples of what those look like. I'm not going to say too much about this, but I think this is also really interesting. It raises questions about kind of moral geographies, right? Are we offshoring moral responsibility, right, when we put prisoners in foreign prisons, or is this a reflection of the underlying culture? I want to highlight this relational aspect of transnational processes, right? So often what happens on the outside comes back. This idea is about a kind of boomerang effects. And these have consequences back on democracy and back on social relations. So these are some of the kind of problems that I've encountered trying to get this study really off the ground and trying to come to grips with it. During the pandemic, we had invited to one of our seminar series online, the authors, Karita Brown, but she came, but she co-wrote this book with Jose Isaacson about the sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois. And she gave the seminar on this. They wrote this book, and it's been part of a renaissance in sociology of revisiting Du Bois's work and bringing him back into, right, the foundations of the discipline and how they're relevant for today. I wouldn't say this was, they came, and I found this so inspirational. I went to graduate school in sociology, and we never studied Du Bois. When I found this book and then the subsequent writings, again, really inspirational, and we're trying to use, like, this as a tool, an analytical tool with many of the different concepts Du Bois wrote about, but also the methodological approaches that he's developed over the very long course of his writing and different elements. And one of the, I think, he's known in the U.S., right, for writing about the Philadelphia story and ethnography, but for, I think, the borders, for European situation, his work on racism and democracy was truly a global look, right? That it wasn't democracy contained within one society, but what were the relationships between democracies and the colonial period, for example. And he wrote this book, Color and Democracy. He takes that up there, where the fate is linked between people of color and democracy, that these are absolutely linked. And unless we understand historical formations, unless we understand the challenges, we won't really understand what democracy is all about. racialized modernity and transnationalism. This was really built into his theory about modern society, right? So modern society, when you read the classics, it's as if industrialization takes place in Germany or England, completely oblivious to the colonies or the economic transnational relationships. For Du Bois, right, that all of that is located in concrete historical formations. And so this is, again, a methodological tool, but it's also like a theoretical idea about trying to connect, right, what happens in one place to another, this relationality and interconnectedness. What's interesting about Du Bois also, so he's dealing with, we could say, these global processes, these long-term historical formations, but he connected that to lived experience. And this was another, I would say, methodological insight that comes very early in this work that somehow, sort of gets dropped out or left out. Myself, I would say I'm not very, I'm inspired by that, but I haven't incorporated that into my own methodology. Subjectivity. He was one of the first to write about the social constructedness of race relations, but also of whiteness. And this becomes really important when we're thinking about the case of Sweden. So he had, right, ideas and arguments about whiteness itself, a subjectivity, a way of thinking about the world connected to the power. And creating the global color line, which is a metaphor, but it's also a way of formulating and thinking about racial hierarchies, but a division across racial classification. It's structural inequality. We can think about the kind of macro processes there about how this comes about, and also the lived experience of the color line. Connecting to these other points about, concrete historical formations for Du Bois. So he identified a global color line, but he said this is going to vary over time and space. So it's not like a real fixed line that is the same across time and space. It's variable, and it will vary by context, and it has to be remade, right? It made by human agency. And so this is the piece that I'm working with now, is to try to look at how the color line is being remade, right, in real time. So going back to, right, this case, especially, I'm going to focus more on the far right here and trying to use some of these tools from Du Bois to understand what's happening. Myself and a doctoral student, we wrote this paper about trying to use, again, Du Bois and the color line and looking at the Sweden Democrats there. So they are here, right, on the beach doing these kinds of pushbacks. They distributed these flyers to this misinformation, basically, of flyers. It was information saying that, you might have heard positive things about our country and the Swedish people, that we are friendly, generous, and hardworking. This might be true, but our society is falling apart. Our wealth is gone. We have to borrow money to provide education and basic health care. After decades of mass immigration, our previously safe country is not safe anymore. Not only do we have very high numbers of shootings and gang-related violence, where grenade attacks in public spaces are no longer surprising, but Sweden now also demonstrates the second highest number of rape reports in the entire world. Sweden is temporarily helping those who flee war and terror, but we're only available to offer tents and camps and beds, and you will eventually be sent back home. Sweden is a modern Western country. Here, women and men are equal. Forced marriages and polygamy will never be accepted. Halal slaughter, wearing niqab or burqa in public places will be forbidden in our country. And this is signed by the people of Sweden. And there was a great, this was published in the newspaper in Sweden, and a pensioner wrote back to the paper to say, the people of Sweden, except for Birgitta, Svensson, I did not sign this, piece of paper. But some of these things are true in the sense that Sweden has, right, brought in refugees and asylum seekers. We have had concerns about crime. That is true. But all these other statements, this is misinformation. There's no camps and tents, and there's no guarantee. The Sweden Democrats want to send people back, right? They don't want anyone there, but this is not happening, right? This is all manufactured, and these parts about the slaughter and the burqa, none of that is happening, right? So this is all about misinformation, intimidation, and deterrence. We argue, right, that we're using Du Bois again, that this is a form of violence that they're doing, the kind of form of violence. We talk about the hard violence of white privilege, and this goes to this kind of non-binary or idea of how this works. So it's like you kind of think about, like, how is it that these people went there? They're not government. They're not border agents. They're not police. They have no authority to go to Lesbos. Nothing. They went there because they're EU Swedish citizens, basically as tourists, and they filmed themselves posting on Facebook on their vacation to Greece, right? And they're, taking snaps. Their vacation to Greece, this is what they did, right, on their vacation, was to distribute these flyers, this misinformation, and to try to prevent those who were seeking asylum from onward mobility, right, trying to deter them from going north. They were very particular about going north, right? I don't think they really cared what happened, if they went somewhere else, but it was definitely, they didn't want anyone going further to Sweden. And, how do they do this, right? They get away with this because they're white, right? Those three, if you just look at this, I mean, here you go. But, right, they look like NGOs. Here they are. They don't look like these kind of far right activists. And they were able to do that. Their whiteness protected them, walk on the beach and confront, right, asylum seekers. They also, and connects to Du Bois, their sense of entitlement, that they could go there and tell other people what to do, right? That's a form of violence, and it's a form of entitlement that you, as a white person, a white Swede, that you have the authority to tell other people how they can live, right? With misinformation, but also to block them from their right to seek asylum, because that they believe, right, they have the right to impose their own view on this kind of social order. So we write about this, right? And there, again, this is a face-to-face interaction. It could be quite threatening to those who are there, right? Being told like all this horrible stuff about Sweden is physically intimidating, but I also think it's this idea about this entitlement or white privilege, right? Being on the beach telling people what to do. This connects, right, going, like if we think about the historicity from Du Bois, this connects to Swedish history of racism, and Carl Linnaeus, who, right, created this like table, right, and classification of plants and animals and of different races. So this is like the, definitely connecting to Sweden. Sweden has a long history of racial hierarchies, past and present. Biological racism is discredited. The party SD, they began as a neo-Nazi party. This has been disavowed by the party leaders. So if anyone claims these things, right, they're thrown out of the party. But it's a bit of a dance between the views and how people express them. So this more of a question mark around that. But they do try to kick people out who espouse neo-Nazi beliefs. Cultural racism, this is a more common form in Sweden, where Muslims are highly racialized and perceived to be incompatible with Swedish or democratic society. And this was very recent. Jimmy Åkesson is the leader of the Sweden Democrats, has basically said Muslims cannot be Swedish. And this is a new statement that he's made, because he was a bit more, you can integrate if you, basically act Swedish. So there's a history of white nationalism. I wrote about white chauvinism, welfare nationalism, and you start to see this kind of fringe idea about great replacement as becoming more in the mainstream, right? And this is, Jimmy Åkesson, this was just recently, right? This kind of statement. And this is Jimmy Åkesson. He went to, those other members went to Lesbos in Greece. Jimmy Åkesson, a few years later, he went to Turkey, to this border, and was basically handing out these flyers, right? Sweden is full. Don't come to us. We can't give you anything. I'm sorry about this. We're still great. We're still really good people. There's questions whether or not he was actually removed from Turkey by the authorities. He filmed that when he was being escorted out of the airport. He's very technologically savvy and very media savvy. So he picked up his phone and started filming that, and then going on about how Turkey is like an authoritarian regime, not letting like freedom of expression. This is who we're dealing with. This is, part of an offshoring, right? They go to the barricades, they put their own bodies there, and they're trying to push the color line further east. Right? They're really out there in Turkey and in Greece, right? Trying to enforce the border, the metaphor of the color line. What also has come back is they didn't stop there, right? So this is they've gone out there to these external borders, but they came back to Sweden. And this is, the transnational processes are not one way, but there were a number of blowback effects of this, and they've started to basically reconstruct or reproduce a color line at home based on some of that same logic that they were doing at the external border. And this is a concept I'm using Stockholm's Vit, which just means it's Stockholm white, and it is literally a paint, and it's every living room in Stockholm where I live is painted with this color. I took a picture of my living room and I was like, oh no, it's definitely, Stockholm Vit. If you want to sell your apartment, you'll have to do this. So it's literally a paint color of white. But I'm going to use it as a kind of cultural process of recognition, right? That it is about a kind of literally whitewashing of the racial history in Sweden and the racialized violence. Yeah, that's not my living room, but I'm sad. I'm sad to say, like, it looks very similar. So, but I think as a cultural process we can focus on, right? It's a whitewashing, right? That we in Sweden, we're good people, we're colorblind. You act like a Swede and you're going to be fine. And so there's this whole denial going on in reproduction at the same time. And thinking about Du Bois, it's a local variant of a color line, right? So it's going to take particular forms in Sweden. There's these certain local aspects of it. And it won't, I don't think it'd be a surprise to anyone in here. It is often, although not exclusively, focused on questions about crime, punishment, and migration. This is how we're going to enforce this color line, by linking and conflating all of these aspects. This comes to the 2022 election, where we see this in action, right? So they've gone out there in 2016, 2018 to try to enforce a color line abroad. They bring all of that back, build on the history. And this entire election that we had in the fall in September was based on these, was based on the kind of a lot of anxiety and concern about crime and migration, as if migrants, those who have come from the outside, have brought crime, and that they're not compatible with Swedish society, and that we really need law and order, we need more prisons, we need more policing. I mean, all of these things, right, which are, it harks back to the 1990s in terms of more policing, more prisons. The result of this election, SD was the second largest party in Sweden. And they were part of a right-wing coalition, which is now in government. So they won the election, and they have a fairly large influence over the direction of crime, migration, also the culture ministry, right? There's worries about the university, about what we might be able to. They start looking at course blood. That hasn't happened yet. Maybe that's just a little bit of paranoia. But they have been influential, even though they're more partners than a governing party. The left parties, they offered during this election, they offered no counter narratives to any of this. And those who familiar with the Nordic nationalism book, that's a left wing project, right, is to exclude, right, others who are not members. And so it's not so surprising. They were blamed for it, but they also had the same thing. So this is just some campaign images, right? This is the now prime minister. He's a leader of the moderate party. And this is basically, it's a Swedish variant of you do the crime, you're going to do the time. And going after gangs. There's a lot of anxiety about gang criminality and increasing penalties for gang crime, but there is no legal definition of what a gang is, right? So this is all about, right, certain ethnic groups and certain neighborhoods that are targeted as gang and gang members and young people. So there's absolutely no legal definition. This is a campaign poster from the Social Democrats, right? This is the big left party that was in government before. That was the former prime minister. And this is basically, Magdalena is talking to a young person in a hoodie. Don't become, no young should become a criminal, right? And this is the, as if it's just an assumption that this young person, and in Swedish context, this is coded as an ethnic minority kid, right? It's we would see this and we would know who she's talking to, and that the assumption is, oh, of course it's going to be a criminal, and then she's talking to him in this super patronizing way. This is a campaign. This was tweeted. This image was tweeted. This is a metro subway car in Sweden that's decorated the SD. They paid to have this painted in their colors. So they had a whole car painted in their, little friendly logo with the flowers. But this was tweeted basically in a very offensive tweet saying this train was basically the next stop is Kabul. And they ran on a program of basically 1 million deportations, right? They wanted to see basically foreign citizens committed crime or not, right, deported. And this is how they were going to get there. So the SD wins this election, and they, I said the right-wing coalition wins, but I would say it was a win for SD and their influence. And the parties, this coalition came together, a number of parties who were in this right-wing coalition, and they came up with this, what's called the Tito Agreement. And these are a set of proposals. So some of this is not passed yet, and some of it may not pass. But this is stretching the imaginations of what might be possible in the Swedish context. And this is what they want to do, right? More young people of color, put them in prison. So they want to hire more police, build more prison. Offshore foreign offenders in foreign prisons, limit family reunification, deport foreign citizens, denaturalize citizens, increase surveillance. This is the stop and search, criminalize gang membership, and detain asylum seekers in transit centers, offsite, offshore. All of this, right? So you can see like it's both the kind of external, like let's send people away, but it's also inside, like let's do the neighborhoods, and it's a completely like an inside and outside. The color line is out there, but we're also going to reproduce it inside. And it's expanding, right? A carceral archipelago, outside and inside, eroding civil liberties, human rights, social solidarity, right? For sociologists, we're really concerned about, right? The kind of break in trust. And all of these they're targeted and they will impact racial and ethnic minorities, especially young people, right? This is the major shift, is the focus and much more aggressive hostility towards young people, right, who were for a long time much more protected in the Swedish criminal justice system and in society more generally. And all of this, right, I want to argue or develop, right, this is the kind of Swedish version, right, the Stockholm White. Why does all this matter? You may have seen this, seen this graph before. This is kind of why I think all of this really does matter. It has these negative effects, right, back on society. This is this expansive nature of using penal power. It doesn't just stop right out of prison. It goes into society. It goes into social relations. It changes social relations. It changes how we think and interact with those who've been in prison or who's subjected to it. We can think of this sort of blowback in creating collective harm. So it's not only the infringement of rights of individuals, but it's collective harms for the society. We can see, right, changing cultural sensibilities, an erosion of core values, erosion of legal protections, democratic deficits. Who gets to decide all of this? And we already, see like infringements on trust and solidarity, citizenship becoming more important. But that's because we're excluding other people. Misrecognition, stigma. Now, and here's the part that is more, that needs to be empirically established, right? We know from the past when democratic societies have high degrees of inequality. This can be economic inequality, social inequality. It can be destabilizing. And so I was sort of leaving at that. But now, after looking at this just expansion of all of these tools, I'm sort of left with, well, maybe it's stabilizing, right? And this is the part, like maybe we just misunderstood all of this. It's not that all of this violence, excess violence, is destabilizing for democracy, but maybe this is in fact the way that they will survive and reproduce themselves. No, do we call them something else? Is it a different category? Does that even matter? And I do think this kind of new dimension for me anyway is to try to think more clearly about the role of violence in democratic societies, but also the role of the radical right, in terms of trying to capture their role in this. They've definitely pushed this, but they're building on a foundation. Is it an amplification or is it a break, right? And how do we come to grips with that? So just to wrap up, I'm working on these papers. So some of them have been published, some of them take up different pieces, some of them are kind of in progress. They take up different things. And the kind of question, for you is to is the next steps, right? Where the pieces of this that could be developed, should be developed empirically or theoretically, or right to kind of Yeah, to kind of take it piece by piece, because again, I have to say the spatial aspect of all of this caused me many more problems than, say, the historical, right? Oh, you just change a timeline, change the causes. But when we start to like open up, all of a sudden we are in fact in a really like borderless analytical framework. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.